In the autumn of 1891, in the small industrial town of Millerville, Pennsylvania, local authorities made a discovery so disturbing that the official records were immediately sealed and remained classified for over 30 years. 17 people were found chained in the basement of the abandoned Millerville Opera House, their bodies bearing signs of prolonged captivity and systematic abuse. What made this case even more horrifying was that all 17 victims were supposedly dead. Their death certificates had been filed months, even years earlier, across 3 different counties. The man responsible, Cornelius Vandermeer, had been operating what appeared to be a legitimate traveling circus for over a decade. But beneath the colorful tents and crowds of laughing children lay one of the most twisted schemes of human exploitation ever documented in American history. The local newspaper was forbidden from printing the full details, and witnesses were threatened into silence by corrupt officials who had profited from this nightmarish enterprise for years. Before we continue with the story of Cornelius Vandermeer and his Cabinet of Wonders, I want to ask you something important. If stories like this fascinate you as much as they do me, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's darkest historical mysteries. And I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment below and tell me your state or city. Now let's dive into what really happened in Millerville, Pennsylvania, in that terrible autumn of 1891. The discovery that would expose Vandermeer's operation came not through diligent police work, but through a desperate act of courage by someone who had witnessed the horror firsthand. Millerville in 1891 was a town caught between 2 worlds. The old Pennsylvania countryside, with its rolling hills and German immigrant communities, was rapidly giving way to industrial progress. Coal mines dotted the landscape, and the newly completed Pennsylvania Railroad branch had brought prosperity to some and desperation to others. The population had swollen to nearly 8,000 souls, many of them recent immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and Eastern Europe, drawn by promises of steady work in the mines and steel foundries. It was a town where people minded their own business, where a man's past mattered less than his ability to work hard and pay his debts. This attitude of willful blindness would prove to be exactly what Cornelius Vandermeer needed to operate his twisted enterprise for so many years without detection. Vandermeer himself was an imposing figure, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of commanding presence that made people listen when he spoke. He claimed to be from a wealthy Dutch family in New York, though no one had ever bothered to verify his background. What mattered was that his money was real, and he spent it freely in Millerville's shops and taverns. He had purchased the old opera house in 1887, ostensibly to use as winter quarters for his traveling show, Vandermeer's Cabinet of Wonders. The Cabinet of Wonders was, by all outward appearances, a typical traveling circus of the era. It featured acrobats, animal acts, musical performances, and yes, a freak show. Such exhibitions were enormously popular in late 19th century America, drawing crowds who paid good money to gawk at people with physical differences or disabilities. What set Vandermeer's show apart, locals would later claim, was the remarkable quality of his performers and the haunting, almost supernatural quality of their acts. There was Eliza, billed as the bone serpent woman, whose body could contort in ways that defied human anatomy. There was giant Johann, the Bavarian colossus, who stood nearly 8 feet tall and could bend iron bars with his bare hands. Most memorable was little Mary Catherine, known as the Singing Angel, a young woman with a beautiful voice who appeared to be missing both arms, though her sleeves were always carefully arranged to conceal the exact nature of her condition. What the audiences didn't know was that many of these performers had not willingly joined Vandermeer's troupe. They had been carefully selected, acquired through means that would not be fully understood until that terrible day in October when the truth finally came to light. The town's sheriff, Josiah Cromwell, was a man who had grown comfortable with the arrangement Vandermeer had proposed shortly after his arrival. A monthly payment of $50, more than most men in Millerville made in 2 months, ensured that Cromwell asked no uncomfortable questions about Vandermeer's business practices or the occasional reports of missing persons that seemed to coincide with the circus's visits to neighboring towns. Dr. Heinrich Kellerman had arrived in Millerville 6 months after Vandermeer, claiming to be a German physician specializing in disorders of human development. He rented a small office above the general store and quickly established himself as Vandermeer's business partner and the show's official medical consultant. What the townspeople didn't realize was that Kellerman's medical credentials were entirely fabricated, and his real expertise lay in chemistry, specifically in the preparation of drugs that could keep people docile and compliant for extended periods. The 3 men, Vandermeer, Cromwell, and Kellerman, had created what they believed to be the perfect criminal enterprise. They would identify suitable candidates in small towns throughout Pennsylvania and the surrounding states, people with disabilities, unusual physical characteristics, or simply those who wouldn't be immediately missed. Orphans were particularly valuable targets, as were recent immigrants with no family connections in America. Their method was sophisticated for its time. Kellerman would pose as a doctor offering free medical examinations or treatments to vulnerable individuals. Once he had them alone, a carefully prepared mixture of laudanum and other opiates would render them unconscious. By the time they awoke, they were hundreds of miles away, chained in the basement of the Millerville Opera House with no memory of how they had arrived there. But the true horror of Vandermeer's operation went far beyond simple kidnapping. It was a systematic process of breaking down human beings and rebuilding them as performers, using techniques that combined psychological manipulation, physical abuse, and chemical dependency. The goal was not just to make them perform, but to make them believe they had no choice, no past, and no future beyond their role in the Cabinet of Wonders. The first crack in Vandermeer's carefully constructed facade appeared on the evening of October 12, 1891, when a young woman stumbled into the office of the Millerville Weekly Gazette, barely conscious and speaking in what seemed like disconnected fragments. Thomas Fairchild, the newspaper's editor and primary reporter, was working late when he heard the frantic knocking at his door. When he opened it, he found a girl who appeared to be in her early 20s, though malnutrition had made her exact age difficult to determine. Her clothes were tattered, her feet bare and bleeding, and her eyes held a wild, terrified expression that Fairchild would never forget. "They're still down there," she whispered, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "In the dark. They can't get out. The chains are too heavy." Fairchild helped her to a chair and offered her water, which she drank greedily. As she gradually calmed down, her story began to emerge in fragments that initially made little sense. She spoke of a place beneath the opera house where people were kept in small rooms, of a man who came with needles and bitter medicine, of being forced to practice the same movements over and over until her body screamed in pain. "My name is Sarah," she said, though she seemed uncertain even about this basic fact. "Sarah Henley. I think I'm from Lancaster. But they told me I was dead. They showed me papers that said I was dead." Fairchild was initially skeptical. The girl's story was so outlandish and her mental state so fragile that he wondered if she might be suffering from some form of dementia or hysteria. But something about her desperation, the specific details she provided, and the genuine terror in her eyes convinced him that she was telling the truth about something. She described the layout of the opera house basement in remarkable detail, including architectural features that Fairchild knew to be accurate. She spoke of specific individuals, other captives, providing names and descriptions that were too consistent and detailed to be delusions. Most compelling of all, she knew things about Vandermeer's business operations that no outsider should have been able to know. "There's a ledger," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Mr. Vandermeer keeps it in his office. It has all our names, where we came from, how much we cost. He calls us his investments. Some of the entries go back years, Mr. Fairchild. Years." As Sarah continued her account, Fairchild began to understand the scope of what she was describing. This wasn't simply a case of exploitation or abuse. It was an organized criminal enterprise that had been operating under everyone's noses for the better part of a decade. The realization filled him with a combination of horror and professional excitement. If Sarah's story was true, he was looking at the biggest story of his career. But first, he needed proof. And getting that proof would mean confronting some of the most powerful men in Millerville, men who had the resources and connections to destroy anyone who threatened their operation. Sarah's escape had been possible only because of a mistake in her evening medication. Kellerman's assistant, a nervous young man named Peter, who helped with the daily care of the captives, had miscalculated her dose of laudanum. Instead of the stupor that usually followed her medication, Sarah had experienced unusual clarity and alertness. When Peter failed to properly secure her shackles during what should have been her weakest period, she had managed to work herself free. The basement of the opera house was a maze of small, windowless rooms that had been converted into cells. Each room contained a single captive, chained to the wall in such a way that they could lie down but couldn't reach the door. A complex system of pulleys and locks ensured that only Vandermeer and Kellerman could release the restraints. Sarah's room had been next to that of Johann, the giant whom audiences knew as the Bavarian Colossus. Through whispered conversations over the course of months, she had learned his real name, Johann Brenner, a simple-minded immigrant from Bavaria who had been working as a dock laborer in Philadelphia when Kellerman's men found him. Johann's enormous size and gentle nature had made him perfect for Vandermeer's purposes, but the constant drugging and psychological abuse had reduced him to a childlike state of dependency. In the room on her other side was Mary Catherine, the singing angel, whose real name was Catherine O'Malley. Catherine had been born with a rare condition that had resulted in the underdevelopment of her arms, but she had possessed a remarkable singing voice that had made her a local celebrity in her hometown of Scranton. She had disappeared after accepting an invitation to audition for what she believed was a legitimate theatrical company. That had been 3 years earlier. The horror of their situation went beyond the physical captivity. Vandermeer and Kellerman had systematically worked to destroy their captives' sense of identity and hope. They were given new names, new backgrounds, and were constantly told that their families believed them to be dead. False death certificates were prepared and filed with local authorities, often with the assistance of Sheriff Cromwell, who maintained contacts in multiple counties throughout Pennsylvania. The psychological manipulation was perhaps even more cruel than the physical abuse. Captives were told that their families had given up searching for them, that they had been forgotten and abandoned. They were shown forged letters supposedly from loved ones, expressing relief that their burden had been removed. For many of the captives, particularly those who had been held for years, this systematic assault on their sense of self-worth and connection to the outside world had been devastatingly effective. Fairchild spent the next 3 days quietly investigating Sarah's claims, and what he discovered chilled him to the bone. A review of death certificates filed in Millerville and surrounding counties over the past 5 years revealed a disturbing pattern. An unusually high number of individuals with disabilities or physical differences had supposedly died in accidents or from sudden illnesses, often with minimal witness testimony and cursory investigations. Even more troubling was the discovery that many of these deceased individuals bore striking resemblances to performers in Vandermeer's show. The dates also correlated almost perfectly with the circus's travel schedule through various Pennsylvania towns. Armed with this preliminary evidence, Fairchild made the decision to confront Sheriff Cromwell directly. It was a decision that nearly cost him his life. Cromwell's office was located in the basement of the town hall, a cramped space that smelled of pipe tobacco and unwashed bodies. When Fairchild arrived on the morning of October 16th, he found the sheriff cleaning his revolver, an activity that seemed calculated to send a message. "Tom," Cromwell said without looking up from his weapon, "I hear you've been asking some interesting questions around town." Fairchild had prepared for this conversation. But facing Cromwell in his lair, surrounded by wanted posters and the implements of law enforcement, he felt his confidence waver. Still, he pressed forward with his inquiry about the death certificates and their suspicious timing. Cromwell's response was swift and brutal. Without warning, he struck Fairchild across the face with the butt of his revolver, sending the journalist crashing to the floor. Blood streaming from a gash above his left eye, Fairchild looked up to find Cromwell standing over him, the gun now pointed directly at his head. "You're going to forget everything that crazy girl told you," Cromwell said, his voice calm and conversational. "You're going to forget you ever saw her. And if I hear that you've been spreading stories about upstanding citizens like Mr. Vandermeer, well, accidents happen in mining towns, Tom. Men disappear all the time." But Cromwell had made a critical error. In his arrogance, he had essentially confirmed Sarah's story, while simultaneously revealing his own involvement in the conspiracy. Fairchild, despite his terror, was still thinking like a journalist. Every word Cromwell spoke was further evidence of the corruption that had allowed Vandermeer's operation to flourish. Fairchild left the sheriff's office convinced that he was in mortal danger, but also more determined than ever to expose the truth. He knew that he couldn't rely on local law enforcement, and that any attempt to contact state or federal authorities would likely result in word getting back to Cromwell before help could arrive. His solution was both brilliant and desperately dangerous. If he couldn't bring the authorities to the evidence, he would bring the evidence to the authorities and to the public. Over the next week, Fairchild worked with Sarah to plan an infiltration of the Opera House basement. Sarah's knowledge of the building's layout and the routines of the guards would be crucial, but the plan would require precise timing and no small amount of luck. The goal was not rescue. That would require more resources than Fairchild possessed. Instead, they would gather irrefutable proof of the captive's existence and Vandermeer's criminal enterprise. Fairchild would photograph the basement cells, document the conditions of the prisoners, and if possible, obtain copies of Vandermeer's records. But as they prepared for this dangerous mission, neither Fairchild nor Sarah realized that their activities had not gone unnoticed. Kellerman, whose training in observation and analysis made him naturally paranoid, had begun to suspect that Sarah's escape had not been as random as it initially appeared. On the evening of October 23rd, as Fairchild was preparing his camera equipment for the infiltration planned for the following night, Kellerman made a disturbing discovery. A routine inventory of his medical supplies revealed that several vials of chloroform were missing, along with a quantity of photographic chemicals that had no legitimate medical use. The realization that someone was planning to document his operation sent Kellerman into a panic. He immediately contacted Vandermeer and Cromwell, and the three men began to implement what they called their emergency protocol, a plan they had developed for the possibility that their operation might be discovered. The emergency protocol was simple in its brutality. Eliminate all evidence, including the captives themselves. What Fairchild and Sarah didn't know was that their planned infiltration had been anticipated. Kellerman's discovery of the missing chemicals had prompted the conspirators to accelerate their timeline dramatically. Instead of waiting to see what evidence might be gathered against them, they decided to eliminate the threat entirely. On the night of October 24, 1891, as Fairchild and Sarah approached the Opera House under cover of darkness, they walked directly into a trap that had been carefully prepared for them. The building appeared deserted, exactly as Sarah had predicted it would be. Vandermeer and his associates typically spent their evenings at the Millerville Social Club, a private establishment where the town's wealthy and influential residents gathered to drink, gamble, and conduct business away from prying eyes. This routine had provided Sarah with the opportunity she needed to escape, and Fairchild was counting on it to provide the cover they needed for their investigation. They entered through a basement window that Sarah had deliberately left unlocked during her escape. The basement was pitch black, filled with the smell of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else. A sweet, cloying odor that Fairchild couldn't immediately identify. Using a small lantern with a heavily shaded flame, they began to navigate the maze of makeshift cells. What Fairchild saw in that dim light would haunt him for the rest of his life. The captives were in far worse condition than Sarah's descriptions had prepared him for. Many appeared to be severely malnourished, their bodies bearing signs of systematic abuse and medical experimentation. Several seemed to be in states of drug-induced stupor, responding only minimally to Sarah's whispered attempts to communicate with them. Johann, the gentle giant, was shackled with chains that had worn deep grooves in his wrists and ankles. His enormous frame had been reduced to skin and bones, and his eyes held a vacant expression that spoke of a mind that had been broken beyond repair. When Sarah spoke his name, he looked toward her with a flicker of recognition, but seemed unable to comprehend what was happening. Catherine O'Malley was in even worse condition. The beautiful voice that had once made her a local celebrity had been reduced to a hoarse whisper, apparently the result of damage to her throat from forced performances while under the influence of Kellerman's drugs. She was conscious but seemed unable to focus on anything for more than a few seconds at a time. As Fairchild began setting up his camera equipment to document these horrors, Sarah moved through the basement, checking on other captives and whispering words of encouragement. It was during this process that they made a discovery that transformed their understanding of Vandermeer's operation from merely criminal to something approaching the demonic. In what had once been the Opera House's wine cellar, they found a makeshift laboratory where Kellerman conducted his experiments. Tables lined with glass bottles, syringes, and surgical instruments suggested medical procedures that went far beyond simple sedation. Detailed notes, written in German but partially translated into English, described experiments in behavioral modification, pain tolerance, and what Kellerman referred to as psychological reconstruction. But the most damning evidence was found in Vandermeer's office, located in what had once been the Opera House's box office. Hidden behind a false panel was the ledger Sarah had described, but its contents were far more extensive than she had realized. The ledger contained detailed records of 43 individuals who had been acquired for the Cabinet of Wonders over a period of 8 years. Each entry included the person's real name, place of origin, the circumstances of their acquisition, and their assigned stage identity. More disturbing still were the notations indicating which captives had died in custody and how their deaths had been concealed. 17 individuals were listed as currently active performers. The remaining 26 were marked as discontinued, a euphemism that Fairchild realized must refer to captives who had died during their imprisonment or who had been murdered when they became too sick or psychologically damaged to perform. But as Fairchild photographed the ledger pages by the light of his shaded lantern, a sound from the basement stairs made his blood run cold. Heavy footsteps were descending toward them, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. Their trap had been sprung. The sweet, cloying odor that Fairchild had noticed earlier suddenly became recognizable. It was chloroform, and the concentration in the air was increasing rapidly. Someone had been pumping the chemical into the basement ventilation system, probably for several minutes, before they had even realized they were in danger. Sarah, who had been moving between the cells, checking on other captives, suddenly collapsed near the far end of the basement. Fairchild, fighting against the effects of the drug, managed to gather his camera and the most important ledger pages before his own consciousness began to fade. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the imposing figure of Cornelius Vandermeer descending the stairs, carrying a lantern in one hand and a revolver in the other. Behind him came Sheriff Cromwell and Dr. Kellerman, along with 2 men Fairchild didn't recognize, presumably hired muscle brought in to help implement their emergency protocol. As consciousness faded, Fairchild realized with crystal clarity that he and Sarah were about to become the next entries in Vandermeer's ledger of discontinued acquisitions. When Fairchild regained consciousness, he found himself in one of the basement cells, shackled to the wall with the same heavy chains that held the other captives. His camera was gone, along with the ledger pages he had tried to preserve. Sarah was in the cell next to his, still unconscious from the chloroform. The next several hours brought a level of terror that Fairchild had never imagined possible. Vandermeer, Kellerman, and Cromwell took turns interrogating him, demanding to know who else he had told about their operation and whether he had managed to send any information to outside authorities. Their methods were brutal but calculated. Kellerman, drawing on his knowledge of human anatomy and pain, inflicted agonies that left no permanent marks, but were excruciating beyond description. Cromwell relied on more traditional techniques: beatings with leather straps, near drowning in buckets of ice water, and the psychological torture of detailed descriptions of what would happen to Sarah if Fairchild didn't cooperate. But it was Vandermeer who proved to be the most terrifying interrogator. His approach was coldly intellectual, almost academic in its precision. He seemed genuinely curious about Fairchild's motivations, asking detailed questions about his background, his family, his aspirations as a journalist. It gradually became clear that Vandermeer was evaluating whether Fairchild might be converted into another performer for his Cabinet of Wonders. "You have a certain presence, Thomas," Vandermeer mused during one of their conversations. "Intelligent eyes, good bone structure. With the right training and adjustments, you could be quite compelling on stage. I'm thinking perhaps the Scholar of Sorrows or the Melancholy Gentleman. We could develop an act around your supposed tragic history, a former man of letters driven mad by forbidden knowledge." The casual way Vandermeer discussed transforming him into a performing commodity was perhaps more terrifying than any physical torture. It demonstrated the complete absence of normal human empathy that had allowed him to operate his business for so many years. But even as he endured these interrogations, Fairchild was gathering information. The interrogations revealed that the operation was far more extensive than he had initially realized. Vandermeer had contacts in at least 6 states, a network of corrupt officials and medical practitioners who helped identify and acquire suitable candidates for his shows. More disturbing still was the revelation that the Cabinet of Wonders was not Vandermeer's only enterprise. He also operated what he called private exhibitions, exclusive performances for wealthy clients who paid premium prices for more intimate and disturbing entertainments. These private shows often involved forced performances of a sexual or violent nature, and it was these exhibitions that provided the majority of Vandermeer's profits. The emergency protocol that had been triggered by Fairchild's investigation involved not just the elimination of witnesses, but the complete dissolution of the Millerville operation. Vandermeer had already begun making arrangements to relocate his operation to a facility in Ohio, where a corrupt asylum director had agreed to provide cover for his activities. The plan called for the murder of all current captives, the destruction of all records, and the staged accident deaths of anyone who might be able to connect Vandermeer to the operation. This included not just Fairchild and Sarah, but also several townspeople who had asked uncomfortable questions over the years, and even Peter, Kellerman's nervous assistant, who was considered a security risk. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Millerville intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. But Vandermeer had made a crucial mistake in his calculations. He had assumed that Fairchild was working alone, motivated by nothing more than journalistic curiosity and personal ambition. What he didn't know was that Fairchild had been conducting a secret correspondence with his former colleague at the Philadelphia Inquirer, Margaret Dalton, who had established herself as one of the few female investigative journalists in the country. Fairchild had been sending weekly letters to Dalton, initially as a courtesy to keep her informed about small-town life in Pennsylvania. But as he had become suspicious of Vandermeer's operation, his letters had taken on a different tone. In his final letter, sent just 2 days before Sarah's escape, he had explicitly stated his concerns about the Cabinet of Wonders and had requested that Dalton contact federal authorities if she didn't hear from him within 10 days. That 10-day deadline was rapidly approaching, and Dalton had already begun making inquiries with contacts in the Treasury Department and the newly formed Bureau of Investigation. What's more, she had taken the precaution of forwarding copies of Fairchild's letters to colleagues at newspapers in Pittsburgh and New York, ensuring that the story couldn't be completely suppressed, even if something happened to both of them. On the morning of October 28, 1891, as Vandermeer was finalizing his plans to eliminate all evidence of his operation, a telegram arrived at the Millerville Telegraph Office that would change everything. It was addressed to Sheriff Cromwell, but its contents were intended for a very different audience. The telegram was from Margaret Dalton, and it was deliberately worded to appear routine while actually serving as a warning to Fairchild. It read, "Sheriff Cromwell, conducting research for article on traveling entertainments. Require interview with Thomas Fairchild and Cornelius Vandermeer. Federal authorities interested in regional business practices. Arriving November 1st with documentation team. Please arrange meetings. Monsieur Dalton, Philadelphia Inquirer." The telegraph operator, a gossipy man named Henry Walsh, who prided himself on being informed about all the town's business, immediately brought the telegram to Cromwell's attention. But Walsh also mentioned it to several other people during his daily rounds, including the barkeeper at the Millerville Social Club, who mentioned it to Vandermeer that evening. The realization that federal authorities were taking an interest in his operation sent Vandermeer into a panic. The emergency protocol, which had been designed to eliminate local threats, was completely inadequate for dealing with federal investigators and national press attention. Even worse, the telegram's reference to a documentation team suggested that Dalton already possessed evidence of wrongdoing. If that evidence had been shared with federal authorities, Vandermeer's network of corrupt local officials would provide no protection. Faced with the collapse of everything he had built, Vandermeer made a decision that would ultimately lead to his downfall. Instead of attempting to flee or destroy evidence, he decided to accelerate his timeline and implement the most extreme version of his emergency protocol. He would eliminate all the captives immediately, stage a devastating fire that would destroy the opera house and all evidence of his operation, and then disappear with whatever assets he could quickly liquidate. The plan was desperate and poorly conceived, but in his panic, Vandermeer couldn't see any alternatives. What he didn't realize was that his panic-driven decision to move quickly would give his captives, and the authorities, the opportunity they needed to bring his reign of terror to an end. The night of October 29, 1891, began with what appeared to be the systematic execution of Vandermeer's emergency protocol. Kellerman had prepared massive doses of morphine and strychnine, intending to poison all 17 captives quickly and relatively quietly. The plan called for their bodies to be doused with kerosene and burned along with the opera house, eliminating all physical evidence of their imprisonment. But Peter, Kellerman's nervous assistant, had finally reached his breaking point. The young man had been haunted by guilt over his participation in the operation for months, and the prospect of watching 17 people be murdered in cold blood was more than his conscience could bear. Instead of helping Kellerman prepare the poison, Peter made a desperate decision that would save multiple lives. He slipped away from the opera house and ran to the home of Reverend Samuel Brooks, the pastor of Millerville's Methodist Church and one of the few local figures who had never been corrupted by Vandermeer's influence. Brooks initially dismissed Peter's frantic story as the ravings of a madman, but the young man's detailed knowledge of the opera house layout and his accurate descriptions of people who had supposedly died years earlier gradually convinced the Reverend that he was telling the truth. Working together, Brooks and Peter developed a plan to alert state authorities while simultaneously preventing the immediate murder of the captives. Brooks would send urgent telegrams to the Pennsylvania State Police and the governor's office, while Peter would return to the opera house and attempt to delay Kellerman's poisoning operation. But their plan faced a critical obstacle: time. Kellerman had already begun administering what he told the captives were routine sedatives, but which were actually the first stage of a 3-part poisoning process designed to cause what would appear to be natural deaths from heart failure. Peter's return to the opera house was a masterpiece of desperate improvisation. He told Kellerman that Cromwell wanted to interrogate the captives one final time before their elimination, buying precious hours while the Reverend's telegrams made their way to the state capital. Meanwhile, in his basement cell, Fairchild had been working on his own desperate escape plan. The chloroform exposure and subsequent beatings had left him weakened, but his mind remained sharp. He had noticed that his cell's restraints, while effective, were attached to a section of the basement wall that had been damaged by years of moisture and settling. Using a combination of leverage and persistent pressure, he had gradually begun to work the anchor bolt loose from the crumbling masonry. The process was agonizingly slow and painful, and he had to be careful not to let his captors notice his efforts during their periodic checks. As the night progressed, several elements began to converge in ways that none of the participants had anticipated. Fairchild's anchor bolt finally came loose at approximately the same time that Peter was implementing his delaying tactics upstairs, and just as the first state police officers were beginning their journey to Millerville in response to Reverend Brooks's telegrams. Fairchild's escape from his cell was only the beginning of an even more dangerous phase of his ordeal. The basement was still guarded, and he was weakened by days of captivity and torture. But his knowledge of the building's layout, gained during his brief photographic expedition, allowed him to navigate the maze of corridors and reach the other captives. What he found when he began freeing the other prisoners was a testament to both the human capacity for endurance and the devastating effects of prolonged psychological abuse. Many of the captives were so heavily drugged or psychologically broken that they couldn't comprehend what was happening. Others, particularly those who had been imprisoned for years, were terrified that any attempt at escape would result in even worse punishments. Sarah, despite her own trauma, proved to be invaluable in convincing the other captives that this was their only chance for freedom. Her earlier escape had given her credibility with the group, and her knowledge of each person's individual fears and capabilities allowed her to communicate effectively even with those who were barely conscious. But their liberation efforts were complicated by the physical condition of many captives. Johann, the gentle giant, was so weakened by malnutrition that he could barely walk. Catherine O'Malley had developed a severe respiratory condition that made any physical exertion extremely difficult. Several others had injuries or medical conditions that had been deliberately left untreated as part of Kellerman's control mechanisms. As they worked to free as many people as possible, Fairchild and Sarah could hear increasing activity on the floors above them. Shouting voices, heavy footsteps, and what sounded like furniture being moved suggested that Vandermeer and his associates were implementing some aspect of their emergency protocol. The situation reached a crisis point when Kellerman, growing suspicious of Peter's delays, decided to check on the captives personally. His discovery of Fairchild's empty cell and the ongoing liberation efforts triggered an immediate alarm that brought Vandermeer and Cromwell rushing to the basement. What followed was a chaotic confrontation in the narrow basement corridors, with 17 weakened captives caught between their liberators and their captors. Vandermeer, armed with a revolver and backed by Cromwell and several hired men, seemed to have the advantage of position and firepower. But in his rage and desperation, Vandermeer made a critical tactical error. Instead of systematically recapturing the escaping prisoners, he became fixated on Fairchild personally, viewing the journalist's defiance as a personal insult that demanded immediate punishment. This fixation gave Sarah and several of the more mobile captives the opportunity to reach the basement stairs and begin making their way to the upper floors of the building. Their escape was aided by Peter, who had positioned himself at the top of the stairs and was able to provide warnings about the movements of Vandermeer's men on the main floor. The confrontation reached its climax when Cromwell, pursuing Sarah and two other escapees, encountered an unexpected obstacle. Reverend Brooks, who had arrived at the Opera House accompanied by 3 Pennsylvania State Police officers. The Reverend's presence at the scene was not part of any planned rescue operation. Rather, he had become concerned about Peter's safety and had decided to personally verify that help was on the way. The state police officers were an advanced team who had arrived in Millerville faster than anyone had expected, thanks to a fortuitous rail connection. The sight of legitimate law enforcement officials in his opera house sent Cromwell into a panic. His first instinct was to try to maintain his authority as local sheriff, but the state officers had already been briefed about the suspected corruption of local officials. In the confusion that followed, with captives streaming up from the basement and state officers trying to sort out who was whom, Vandermeer made his final desperate gambit. Rather than surrender or attempt to flee, he retreated to his office with Kellerman and barricaded themselves inside. Their plan was to destroy all documentary evidence of their operation and then fight their way out of the building. What they didn't realize was that Fairchild had already photographed the most damning pages of the ledger during his earlier infiltration, and that copies of those photographs were hidden in a location known only to him and Sarah. The standoff in Vandermeer's office lasted nearly 3 hours. During this time, additional state police officers arrived, along with a representative from the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, who had been alerted by Margaret Dalton's contacts in federal law enforcement. Outside the barricaded office, a remarkable scene was unfolding. 17 human beings who had been written off as dead by the official records were being documented, photographed, and interviewed by authorities. Many were in such poor physical condition that they required immediate medical attention, but all were alive, and most retained enough mental capacity to provide testimony about their ordeal. The breakthrough in the standoff came from an unexpected source. Johann Brenner, the gentle giant whose mind had been so damaged by years of abuse, suddenly experienced a moment of clarity when he saw Kellerman through the office window. The rage that erupted from this normally passive man was terrifying in its intensity. Using his enormous strength, Johann began systematically destroying the barricade that Vandermeer and Kellerman had constructed. The heavy furniture that would have stopped normal men was no obstacle to someone of Johann's size and determination. Within minutes, he had created an opening large enough for the state police officers to enter. Kellerman's capture was accomplished without violence. The false doctor had collapsed into a state of nervous exhaustion and offered no resistance. But Vandermeer proved to be more resilient. When the officers entered his office, they found him calmly feeding documents into a small fire he had built in a metal wastebasket. "Gentlemen," he said without looking up from his task, "I'm afraid you're too late. Whatever crimes you believe you can prove died with these papers." But Vandermeer's confidence was misplaced. Even as he destroyed his records, Thomas Fairchild was working with investigators to reconstruct the operation based on his photographs and the testimony of the survivors. More importantly, Peter's detailed knowledge of the day-to-day operations provided investigators with information that no written record could have contained. The arrest of Sheriff Cromwell proved to be almost anticlimactic. Faced with overwhelming evidence of his corruption and the testimony of multiple witnesses, he immediately attempted to negotiate a plea agreement in exchange for information about Vandermeer's broader network of accomplices. But perhaps the most important moment of that terrible night came when Catherine O'Malley, her voice still damaged but her spirit unbroken, began to sing. It was a hymn her mother had taught her as a child, and one by one, the other survivors joined in. Their voices, weak and damaged but still human, filled the opera house with a sound that was both heartbreaking and triumphant. As dawn broke over Millerville on October 30th, 1891, the full scope of Vandermeer's operation was beginning to come into focus. The 17 survivors represented only a fraction of the victims who had passed through his hands over the years. The other 26 individuals listed in his ledger as discontinued would never have the chance to see justice served. The trials that followed the exposure of Vandermeer's operation became a sensation throughout Pennsylvania and the broader United States. The case represented one of the first major prosecutions of organized human trafficking in American legal history, and the proceedings were covered extensively by newspapers from coast to coast. Cornelius Vandermeer was ultimately convicted on 43 counts of kidnapping, 17 counts of unlawful imprisonment, and 26 counts of murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming, combining physical proof, documentary evidence, and the testimony of survivors who had found the courage to speak publicly about their ordeal. His execution, carried out on March 15, 1893, drew protesters both for and against capital punishment. But there was little public sympathy for a man who had systematically destroyed so many lives for profit. Dr. Heinrich Kellermann received a sentence of life imprisonment after cooperating extensively with investigators. His detailed confessions provided authorities with information that led to the arrest of accomplices in 6 states and the exposure of a network of corruption that reached far beyond Millerville. Perhaps most importantly, Kellermann's medical records allowed investigators to understand the full extent of the psychological and physical damage inflicted on the victims, enabling them to provide appropriate treatment and support. Sheriff Josiah Cromwell's cooperation with prosecutors earned him a reduced sentence of 20 years in prison, but he served only 7 years before dying of a heart attack in 1899. His detailed testimony about the corruption of local officials led to the removal of 3 judges, 2 county commissioners, and dozens of minor officials throughout western Pennsylvania. The fate of the 17 survivors varied dramatically. Some, like Sarah Henley, were able to rebuild their lives with the support of their families and communities. Sarah herself became an advocate for victims of human trafficking and worked with law enforcement agencies to identify and prosecute similar operations. Johann Brenner's recovery was more limited. The years of psychological abuse had left him with permanent mental damage, but he was able to live independently with support from his church community in Philadelphia. He never fully regained his ability to speak coherently about his experiences, but he found peace working as a handyman and gardener until his death in 1923. Catherine O'Malley's voice never fully recovered from the damage inflicted during her captivity, but she was able to return to her family in Scranton and eventually married a local merchant who had waited for her despite believing her to be dead. She lived quietly until 1934, rarely speaking about her experiences but maintaining correspondence with other survivors until the end of her life. Thomas Fairchild's coverage of the Vandermeer case established his reputation as one of America's premier investigative journalists. He eventually moved to New York and worked for several major newspapers. But he never forgot the lesson he had learned in Millerville about the importance of giving voice to those who cannot speak for themselves. Margaret Dalton's role in exposing the operation led to her being hired by the Philadelphia Inquirer as their first female investigative correspondent. She continued to work closely with Fairchild on cases involving corruption and human trafficking, and their partnership resulted in the exposure of several other criminal operations throughout the 1890s. The Millerville Opera House was demolished in 1892, and the site remained vacant for decades. In 1934, the city erected a small memorial garden on the location, with a plaque commemorating the 17 survivors and the 26 victims who did not live to see justice served. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Vandermeer case was its effect on American law enforcement and legal procedures. The case demonstrated the need for better coordination between local, state, and federal authorities in investigating crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. More importantly, it highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized populations, immigrants, orphans, and people with disabilities to exploitation and abuse. The publicity surrounding the case led to the establishment of several advocacy organizations and contributed to reforms in how missing persons cases were investigated and documented. The case also had a profound impact on the regulation of traveling entertainments and circuses. New laws required performers to carry documentation proving their voluntary participation, and regular inspections were instituted to ensure that traveling shows were not being used as covers for criminal activities. Yet even as justice was served and reforms were implemented, disturbing questions remained. Cromwell's testimony revealed that Vandermeer's operation was part of a much larger network of human trafficking that extended throughout the eastern United States. While many of his accomplices were eventually arrested, Others simply disappeared, presumably continuing their activities in new locations with new identities. The investigation also revealed that several of the individuals listed as discontinued in Vandermeer's ledger had actually been sold to other operators rather than murdered. Despite extensive efforts by law enforcement, most of these people were never found, and their ultimate fate remains unknown. Perhaps most troubling of all was the discovery that Vandermeer's operation had been able to function for so long precisely because it exploited societal prejudices and indifference toward vulnerable populations. The ease with which death certificates could be falsified for people with disabilities, the willingness of officials to accept bribes to look the other way, and the public's appetite for entertainment that dehumanized performers all contributed to creating an environment where such horrors could flourish. In the end, the Millerville case serves as both a testament to human resilience and a warning about the capacity for evil that exists when greed, prejudice, and power combine in the absence of accountability and justice. The 17 people who survived Vandermeer's Cabinet of Wonders had their names officially restored to the living, their death certificates voided, and their stories preserved for history. But somewhere in the shadows of America's past, how many other voices remain silenced? How many other victims of similar operations never found their way to freedom? This mystery shows us that the most horrifying monsters in history have always been entirely human, driven by greed and enabled by corruption and indifference. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.